I don't know how many of you remember the groundbreaking or the beginning. It is a welcoming, positive, well-equipped center. It says this is a place where important things are going to happen. And back to my childhood when my father was a volunteer in prison ministry, my first trip to DCC, I think I was 11, there was not this kind of resource at the time for folks going through reentry. There wasn't the same sort of strength and recognition broadly that the vast majority of the 6,000 folks in state custody today will return to our communities, and we need to have a system that prepares them to be able to be welcomed, reintegrated, positive, productive citizens. So thank you for what you're doing, and thank you. I'm excited to be here, to be with you. Thank you all for taking the time out this morning to be a part of this conversation. I'm going to just make a few opening remarks that really focus on the federal opportunity that's in front of us, and then invite a conversation about what's going on federally and what impact it might have, and then folks who want to add some things about the state system are welcome to if you feel so inclined. Let me just give you a few numbers, top line to start us off. The federal government spends $7 billion a year incarcerating people. There are about 181,000 federal prisoners today, and that number has come down. But we are spending more on incarcerating people than we are on the DEA, the ATF, and the Marshals combined. And starting about 6 years ago on the Judiciary Committee, I was struck by the range of senators interested in making some changes to how we handle mandatory minimums, the sentencing process, recidivism prevention, and reentry. From John Cornyn, conservative Republican from Texas, former Attorney General, and Mike Lee, some of you may have seen Mike Lee recently, a Republican on the Judiciary Committee from Utah, to Sheldon Whitehouse, liberal Democrat from Rhode Island, former Attorney General, Cory Booker, former mayor of Newark. I've really enjoyed working with a broad bipartisan group on two different bills, and I'll give you just a sort of quick overview of that. This handout, which I hope everybody got a chance to get, and if you don't, I've got a stack of them here, so we could pass those around to folks on the periphery. Do you not have them? Let's make sure we've got folks get a chance to get those. I'll give you just a quick synopsis because we are on the verge of something very exciting, I think, in the Congress. But before I walk through that, let me make sure you've had a chance to see or hear from or recognize. I've got a whole bunch of folks who joined us today from my staff, both here in Wilmington and in Washington. Erica Saunders, my chief counsel, and so if there's anything good in this proposal, the credit goes to Erica and Andy. If it's fundamentally flawed, that's my responsibility. And Andy Crawford, a Delawarean. These are the folks that lead my legal team in Washington. I've also got J.J. Francis with us, and Sean Coit, and David Bowes, and Kate Rohr, who handle a variety of functions, whether it's outreach or communications. Brendan Mackey is not just my veterans advocate, but also going to take some great pictures today. So if you could give them a round of applause for me, because they're the folks. If you get the idea that Washington's a place where people go to fight, not to solve problems, that seems to generally be true these days. But we are more divided, House, Senate, Republican, Democrat, White House from Congress than I've seen in the 10 years I've been there. And yet every now and then, something comes together across a really broad range of backgrounds to put together an opportunity. One of the things that strikes me about this bill is that it's been endorsed by, wait for it, the ACLU and the FOP. There are very few bills that get endorsed by the ACLU and the FOP. I could cite a dozen other groups, but, right, can I get an amen? I mean, that's just not the sort of thing we see all that often. I've already given you the names of some of the senators who worked together on it, but this is because we recognize that in the decades since the war on crime, the war on drugs, and an effort to get tough on crime started in the 80s, there was sort of a one-way movement where generations of politicians have steadily increased mandatory minimums, reduced judicial discretion, and gotten us to a place where we had a record number of nonviolent, low-lying drug offenders getting 10 and 20 and 30-year sentences federally. I'll be clear about this. You know, there are still folks who are dangerous, who commit harms in our community, who deserve incarceration and where, for public safety purposes, they need to not be part of our broader community. But that's not the majority of people who are currently incarcerated, not by a long shot. And given the significant impacts, particularly in communities of color, of a system that produces enormous pressure on individuals to plead, regardless of guilt, and where stacked offenses lead to very long prison terms, we cannot sustain a country where we are a very small percentage of the world population and the largest percentage of the population incarcerated of any country on earth. So we've had a generation now of experimenting with mass incarceration, and we've seen the significant disruptive impacts on families, on communities, and lots of us have come to the conclusion that at enormous expense it doesn't necessarily make us safer. So John Cornyn, for example, one of the leaders in this work in the Congress, as Attorney General in Texas, was part of an effort that significantly reduced the incarcerated population in Texas, saved a lot of taxpayer money, and actually also improved public safety. The first time I heard him say that, my jaw dropped, and I thought, we've got an opportunity here. Let me give you a quick review of what the First Step Act does. It recognizes that reducing recidivism is important, critical actually, but it's not enough. It recognizes this amended version that combines some of the sentencing reforms with some of the criminal justice reforms. Recognizes we need to do more on the front end to reduce the number of people going into prison and then the amount of time they spend incarcerated in the first place. We've added a number of provisions to the First Step bill that came over from the House by a very large bipartisan margin, and I'll mention a couple of them. We reduced the 3 strikes penalty for prior drug felonies from life in prison to 25 years. 25 years in prison is a significant penalty, but the difference from 25 to life is also significant. I think it's important that it gives judges greater discretion to modify or circumvent mandatory sentences for nonviolent, low-level drug offenders. It reduces sentence disparities between crack and powder cocaine offenses, which disproportionately impacted African Americans, and allows their retroactive application. So we've already legislated a reduction in that disparity, but there are folks in prison serving very long terms who were sentenced under that 100-to-1 disparity, where there was no mechanism where judges could go back and revisit that. It clarifies congressional intent on sentencing enhancements for firearm offenses to avoid excessive stacking. And it recognizes the majority of folks in our system will reintegrate back into communities, and so we have to invest more in reentry programs like the Achievement Center. It provides incentives for prisoners to participate in recidivism programs. It allows low-risk prisoners to earn time credits for pre-release custody. It expands compassionate release for elderly and ill patients. It provides reforms that prepare inmates for successful return through more meaningful employment training and opportunities for transition. And it fixes a technicality in current law that prevents some qualified prisoners for utilizing good time credits. So over 30 years, our prison population increased 340%. This is, I think, a good first step to address some of the issues that have really been plaguing our criminal justice system, not for a year or two, but for decades. This bill is by no means perfect, and there are more things I think we can and should do. But to get from the perfect to the good, we had to make some compromises. The president supports this. The majority and minority in the House and Senate support it. It may not get a vote in the next 2 weeks because there is real division in the majority caucus. But the majority leader, Mitch McConnell, has said he is doing a whip count, meaning checking who's for, who's against. It gets virtually every Democrat, and it gets, I believe, more than 24 Republicans. If that, plus the president, plus the House add up, we'll see this signed into law before the end of the year. If it doesn't, we're going to be back at it in January. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what's going on in Washington, and then take the opportunity for us to have a conversation and for me to listen to you. I am interested in what's going on in Delaware. I am informed but not engaged because my principal focus as your senator is on the federal system. Delaware has already done a number of the things that are in this legislation. And folks in Delaware have been working hard at trying to improve our system for quite some time. So I thought a great way to start our conversation would be to invite the Attorney General-elect, Kathy Jennings, who's got a long background in law enforcement and in leadership, and is going to be our next Attorney General in the state of Delaware, to make some opening comments as well. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Coons, for having the courage. You have had the courage to lead in so many different arenas, as we know with recent events. But reforming our nation's criminal justice system is a noble and worthwhile effort. And so I'd like to give a round of applause. And thank you for offering to have me speak. As you know, I've spent the last several months on the campaign trail, and I look around the room and I see people I've worked with for so many years, and it was just such a worthwhile endeavor to get out there and to hear what concerns people throughout the state of Delaware. And I often heard that the criminal justice system is, quote, broken. And I think what that means is that our criminal justice system isn't fair. And people don't have faith in how others are charged, how others are detained, how others are sentenced, and what happens when people come out of prison. And so my goal as the next Attorney General at the state level is to ensure that our criminal justice system is fair to everyone, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of the size of our pocketbook, and regardless of the zip code where we live. In order to do that, we are going to need everybody at this table to help in this very fundamental process, because if we have a criminal justice system that people trust, that people perceive as fair, then Delaware will get it right. There have been reforms that have occurred over the past several years under Attorney General Matt Dehn, who's done a terrific job. But there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think it begins with our cash-based bail system that imprisons people because they are poor before they are ever found guilty of a crime. And it is my goal to move toward a risk-based bail system that gauges violence and that gauges ability to show up for court, and that does not imprison people because they can't afford the dollars to get out of jail. 65% of people imprisoned in Delaware prior to trial are imprisoned on $1,000 cash bail or less. That means they can't come up with $100 to pay a bail bond person, and that's wrong. We need to move away from that unjust system, and it's my priority to continue efforts at bail reform to move away from that. As Senator Coons said, there is an unjust stacking of mandatory sentences, both at the federal level and at the state level, that result in a number of years in prison that don't necessarily make us safer. It's a number of years that does not take into account the individual needs of the offender and the victim's needs. And so my goal is to fundamentally change the unjust stacking of mandatory sentences when doing that doesn't make us safer and hasn't made us safer. At the back end, we really need to do a better job of helping people, and what better place to be than at the Achievement Center. I was here when the Achievement Center wasn't even a building, and have served on the board of the Hope Commission for many years. This really is a crowning achievement that is the result of a collaborative effort. I have seen it work. I have seen it firsthand when we go to graduations. And thank you for everybody's effort to make this just a model of reform. We have a 76% recidivism rate in Delaware for people coming out of prison. That is unacceptable, and it needs to change. And we really need to put dollars into doing this across the state and to scale this up so that people get a chance to succeed when they come out of prison. So I know there are people in this room who have been through the justice system and they are models of success. I want to see that happen on a grander scale. And so thank you, Senator Coons, for your efforts, and I look forward to working with all of you at the state level as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Daryl?
Well, thank you, Senator, for inviting me today. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm currently a PhD student down at the University of Delaware in the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department. I work for the Center for Drug and Health Studies, where we do a lot of work with many people here who are present today at the table. I'm on the core team of the National Criminal Justice Reform Project with Joanna and a few others here with the CJC. I'm also the chairperson for the Council of Corrections, so I work a lot with Wesley on a number of different things. So I have a lot of experience, and I believe that I am qualified to talk about this right here. But let me tell you why I'm certified. As a person who was one of the first people to receive the benefits of the Achievement Center, I know how important it is to get that second chance. So during those 90s, when everybody was getting sentenced to those long, lengthy sentences, I was one of those. Just a poor kid from Riverside, just graduated from college, trying to go to grad school. That's all I was trying to do. And I got caught in a drug conspiracy. And what happened? I received a mandatory sentence. I got enhanced for guns. I got a leadership role. All these things right here. And it wasn't until they actually started addressing the crack and cocaine disparity that the judge or I was let out of jail. 10 years earlier than when I was supposed to be released. So I know how important it is to have that second chance, but not only that second chance, but to be able to come to places like the Achievement Center and have mentors like Charles Madden and like Kathleen Jennings, who has always been one of my champions, to come back into an environment where it was nurturing and refreshing that allowed me to be the person who I knew I could be and my community who believe I could be. So I believe that's very important, and I applaud you. We talked about it a lot of times, 924C, 924G, 841, 841B1C, B1A, the mandatory staff order, stuff about then we talked about it. We talked about the cases where the kid was selling only marijuana, nickel bags of marijuana, brandished his gun, did it 3 times, received a 50-year sentence, stacking. So we talked about all these things right here. But now it's really great to see that some of our efforts and some of the things that we talked about inside of prison finally being put into action. So Senator, we really do thank you, because I believe that when we don't provide the opportunity, we can only expect that we recycle the same people back in. And as a person who was born and raised and nurtured under Dr. Yasser Payne's structural violence, I'm also happy to know that we're going to do some stuff on the front end. And hopefully we'll do something about our school system, because every day where it all starts at. So thank you again, Senator.
Before I ask Rabbi Beals to give us a brief perspective from the faith community, one of the things that Attorney General Dent has recognized in writing and speaking, and he would be here today, but for he's got a medical appointment. We invited a number of folks, the U.S. Attorney, the Chief Justice. It was relatively short notice, so I apologize, and thank you everybody who did make time today. We didn't realize we'd be in the lame duck and an opportunity to talk about this bill and this close to passage. We do need to make upfront investments as a state, and that is hard to do, on fighting the opioid and addiction epidemic, on improving schools, on improving employment opportunities. Now when we have record low unemployment and there's a record number of job opportunities, is the moment when we should have unbelievable opportunity and different outcomes. And this is a challenge and a moment for us to do a better job as a state and a country in fixing the things that, if not addressed, lead to more crime, in particular the opioid and addiction crisis that is tearing up so many families and communities. Let me invite my friend Rabbi Beals to give us a perspective from the faith community about, in the criminal justice system, the justice aspect.
Thank you. First of all, I'm one of many of Senator Coons' rabbis. He has more than one, but I'm the one who'll come in less than 24 hours when the Jewish Sabbath is approaching tonight, and Hanukkah.
Sense of timing is as ever.
But it's important. Comedy is important in everything. So I want to start by saying that I've been in this room before. I was in this room with Delaware Shakes. So that's our statewide Shakespeare company. And they make a point in the fall of taking Shakespeare to places where you wouldn't think Shakespeare would be, including with people recently come out of prison, and people in prison. people in psychiatric centers. I mention that for a reason. When you're done with me, I'll try not to be too long-winded, which is really hard for a rabbi. I want everybody around the room to feel that you're players in this conversation. And I think you'll get a sense that by the time I'm done, that each one of you is in a very unique position to do something really special around this. So I want to start with Delaware Shakes, because you wouldn't have thought I would bring Shakespeare to the room, but Shakespeare's been here, and please God, Shakespeare will be here every fall. So I start with that. I'm wearing 2 yarmulkes this morning. Excuse the metaphor. I like to wear red as my power yarmulke. I'm wearing 1 yarmulke. I was intimidated, so I always use my attire to wear my Senate tie clip. And okay, moving along. 1 yarmulke that I'm wearing today is that I'm the chair of something that you may not know exists. It's called the Delaware Council of Faith-Based Partnerships. One more time. The Delaware Council of Faith-Based Partnership. If you didn't write it down, write it down. And I'll tell you why. It's the only interfaith, 3-county interfaith organization that's in the state. We used to have the National Conference of Christians and Jews. It doesn't exist anymore, and it should include at least Muslims, if not a whole lot of other faiths. So maybe it's not so bad that it doesn't exist, but it didn't have anything to come afterwards. And so when Jack Markell was our governor, he created this organization. And our current, John Carney, he reinvested up. And one of our goals is to deal with the whole issue of recidivism. It's in our chart, it's in our organizational comments about what should we be doing, along with early education. And I don't think we do enough. And I think part of it is we need people to dance with. So I want you to see me as a real partner, right? Rabbi Michael Beal, Congregation Beth Shalom, right around the corner. You can find me really easily. So I want to see not just me, I'm a figurehead, but you have clergy from every flavor in Delaware who want to be involved, and we are invested in being involved at the state level, and we don't ask to do as much as we ought to. So when the senator said come, I came for 2 days. He's my friend, I'd come. But I came because I felt like this is why Governor Markell created the commission in the first place. So, boom, done. Now, I wear another yarmulke. I'm Rabbi of Congregation Beth Shalom. So let me just say this. This is a very dark time of the year. And on Sunday is the Festival of Lights. It's Hanukkah. And the whole point of Hanukkah is to put light in dark places. If you're listening as a Christian, this can sound kind of familiar. What is really Christmas? If not putting dark times to bring light, the light of the world in. It's historically different, but sociologically, it's very similar. And secondly, what are we supposed to do at Christmas and at Hanukkah? We're not supposed to get gifts, tell your children. We're supposed to give gifts. What a gift! Bipartisan cooperation. Messiah is coming, or for Christian, Messiah is coming again. We have not had. I took my pulse this morning. Bipartisan on something significant. Glory, hallelujah.
All right now.
Amen. Okay, I speak Christian and Jewish. Okay. From a religious perspective, I wanted to give you 2 reasons why I think this is so terribly important. So if you're going to write something down again, Deuteronomy 16:20. So we could have a text. Right? So can come to text. Deuteronomy 16:20. Hebrew. Tzedek, Tirdo. It's good to know some Hebrew. WWJC, Hebrew. You spoke Hebrew. Tzedek, Tirdo. Justice, thou shalt pursue. Right? I used to work in city government in LA. It's on City Hall. One of the East Hall. When you go in, that's what it says. Over the mantle. Yeah, I'm going to need it. Okay, so quickly. Why is it repeated? It's repeated for 2. That's in my office. Okay, so why is it repeated? Justice. You might think, in case you didn't hear it the first time, like underscore beaten. No, in Judaism there's no superfluous words. So here's 2 teachings. One is by a Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pishcha, Poland. Don't ask me to say that again. He says, with justice you shall pursue justice. Even the pursuit of justice must be employed only by just means, not by falsehood. So it's not just enough to do justice, you have to do it in a just way. That's the first repetition reason. Second one, justice alone is not enough, because there are many types of justice, just as there are many kinds of truth. Every regime has its own justice. The Torah, our Bible, therefore says, justice, justice you shall pursue, because it must be pursued both by where the means and the ends are just. So that, in a biblical, like in church on Sunday, or for me Saturday, you take that to, or Friday for Muslim prayer. The second issue I want to bring to you is something that is not a Christian verse, but you'll know it. Teshuvah. Teshuvah. T-E-S-H-U-V-A-H. In English, repentance. But it means more than that. It means return. In the Jewish idea, we're not born into original sin. In the Jewish idea, we are born into original goodness. This is so important for this legislation. This legislation assumes every human being born in the image of God has goodness inside of them. And if our justice system is going to do right, it has to help people return to their best self. It's not a competition. The senator's best self and my best self are different, but we all are born into original goodness. And this legislation allows people to come back. There's a fellow named Maimonides, great rabbi, 12th century. He says that it's a 4-step. You heard of the 12 steps? This is the 4 steps for doing repentance. 1, regret. You got to realize the extent of the damage and inwardly adopt a feeling of sincere regret. This legislation can help. 2, ceasing, immediately stop the harmful action. 3, confession and restitution. Verbalize the mistake and ask for forgiveness either from God or from the wrong party, and if possible, right the wrong through compensation. And if the sin is against God, the act of charity should be considered. And 4, resolution. Make a firm commitment not to repeat the sin in the future. And that's what this does. This helps people have a way out so that if confronted with the same challenges, they would make a better choice. This is such a Jewish bill. I'm not exclusively Jewish, but certainly when you look at the sensibilities of 3,200 years of Jewish civilization, this is how could I not come out today? I would be turning my back on everything I've been taught at rabbinical school and at my mother and my father's knee. Finally, not everything can be forgiven. In Judaism, not everything can. For example, murder can't be forgiven because who are you going to ask forgiveness from? If you already killed the person, you can't ask. So there are limits. Also in Judaism, in terms of defaming somebody's good name, bring it down, how do you gossip is just so all over the place, the power of language. So not everything is forgivable. This legislation here is for that too. So I am just so supportive of whatever we can do for you, either as rabbi or as the Delaware Council Faith-Based Partnership. We're at your service. Thank you for your time.
We have about half an hour, at least, maybe a little bit more, to listen to each other and to share perspectives. And I'd like to just start by welcoming, we've got a lot of leaders in law enforcement. We've got Inspector Ash from Wilmington Police Department. We've got the Chief, Colonel Bond from Newcastle County Police. We've got Captain Sawyer from DSP. We've got the head of the Police Chiefs Council, and both the current Chief Maley and Jeff Horvath, Executive Director and current Chief and former Chief. So we've got a lot of folks who have real deep experience from Dover to Wilmington to the state to the county. Inspector, since we're in your home turf, we might ask you to say a few words first, and then, of course, President Calhoun of the state FOP. I'd be interested in just hearing any perspectives on from the law enforcement community. This legislation federally, what's going on in the state, how you see our general direction, why this is a good use of your time.
Yeah, so first, Senator, on behalf of Chief Tracy, he apologizes for not being here. He already had pre-travel plans, so to the Senator and to the distinguished panel. I was sent here on his behalf, and I think, all 3 of you make very valid points. I think as a law enforcement officer, we come into this job with honor to be the guardians of our cities that we work for. I think we have to look at, in law enforcement, the front end of how do we approach things. Zero tolerance doesn't work. Going out and doing blanket enforcement in communities damages our relationships with those communities. With that being said, You know, I think here in Wilmington, you're gonna see 30% reduction in homicides, 111 less shooting victims, significant reductions in shooting incidents and shooting victims, 57% in shooting incidents, 60% less shooting victims. So you ask, how did you do it? The first thing is holding our officers accountable, putting them in the communities that they work and leaving them there so that they know our college students that may be having a hard time. And how do we embrace our communities? Well, our officers are responsible for getting to know their communities so that we can do exactly what the rabbi said and be just in our justice. So I think, this is, legislation that is gonna be impactful on every angle, but we as law enforcement have a responsibility to step up and do our part as well. To be the guardians of that city, not, just arresting people, but reduce crime and reduce arrests at the same time. And Chief Tracy would proudly say that we are reducing crime. We have 13% reductions in overall Part 1 crimes in the city as of this, as of Sunday. And we also have less arrests. What an accomplishment. But that's where we have to take ownership in this type of legislation and own our part and say, what can we do better? Next year, we're gonna be challenged with reducing crime even more, get our returns. But, I think we have a place at the table, and that place is recognizing where we've been, where we are and where we need to be. And engaging the community. That's why we started this job. That's why we came into police work. You ask any police officer, that's what they said at the table when they sat down with the chief in their interview. And so we as law enforcement, we in Wilmington, preach that from the top down. And I think that's how, we can assist in this legislation, and we absolutely support anything that will help our communities and reduce the incarcerated population. And to your point, exactly, Senator, we have violent offenders. Those are the ones, and to the rabbi's point, those are the ones that need to be incarcerated. They're not hopeless, but they need to be incarcerated. And that's where, we'll step up and do our part and support any type of legislation like this. So thank you for this opportunity, Senator.
Captain, Chief, President. Anybody else want to add some thoughts? We've got a lot of folks and not a huge amount of time, but anybody want to add any comments to that?
I would say one thing. I can't go into the room without saying something, right, sir?
That's good.
I would say that on the larger scale, the National is very supportive of these types of legislation.
And there were modifications made to this bill in order
Yes.
to secure the support.
Yes. And just so everyone knows, the state FOP has been working hand in hand with the Chief Justice to try and address a number of these issues. We sit on a number of committees, from the bail to the rewrite to all these things. From a FOP perspective, our biggest concern is the infrastructure and the state and how they will push forward. As a law enforcement officer, we come out, like you said, with one thing in mind, making everybody safe and doing the right thing. What we find as we go along that no matter how hard we push and the good things we do, there's always these roadblocks. And I think, the infrastructure in a lot of these cities, a lot of these towns, that's the big problem, putting an emphasis on what needs to be done and how to address it. I think this piece of legislation puts an emphasis on what needs to be done, and hopefully will push the local legislators to go in the right direction, to get the funding that's needed, to set up facilities like this throughout the state, to get the right programs in place, to get the right opportunities for those that have been arrested or are currently incarcerated and are going to be released under whatever guidelines, to point them in the right direction to get things going. And people don't realize it has a huge impact on law enforcement. I don't know if there's a perception out there, but police officers don't want to arrest people. They don't want to do that. You know, that's not what we're here for. We'd much rather ride around on a bike or our windows down and play football and basketball and baseball with these kids and have fun, but unfortunately, that's not what society brings to us. So, I guess my one point is, we want to help, we've been trying to help in the state. That's all we can do as a state FOP. That's our goal, is to push forward for legislation that reduces recidivism, that gets folks out of prison, that sets up a mechanism where not everybody goes to jail. I know it's not common to hear a police officer say that kind of stuff, you know, but most police officers stay focused on what their main goal is, what they're hired to do, what their job is. We're a paramilitary organization, so we have a certain box that we work in, and that's how we're trained all along to do things. It's not necessarily in our comfort zone to step out in this kind of atmosphere, but it's important for everyone in this room to know that we, on a state level, the FOP, I represent 2,600 police officers throughout the state of Delaware. They all want the same thing. They don't want to have to arrest people. They don't want to do that. And if this helps us get a little closer to that, then we are very supportive. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed, you've been federal public defender for a significant amount of time. And I'd be interested if you and our judge would make any comments about where you see this heading. I probably shouldn't ask anybody to take a position on legislation. I'm not asking. But I'm just interested, Your Honor, Ed, whether you think over the career you had as a federal defender, you've seen changes that we could continue that would make a difference. How you see the impact on communities and families and lives of large mandatory minimums, no judicial discretion, stacking and so forth, and whether you think some of the things discussed and proposed here would have a positive impact.
Senator, before I begin and make some comments, I want to state how fortunate we are to have you in the Senate and recognize all of your colleagues that stand behind this bill. I think it's aptly named in terms of first step because there are many things that we all would want, but we have to be aware of compromise is important and get insufficient consensus to move it forward. And this is a tremendous job that you and your colleagues have done. And it brings hope to so many people. It brings hope to defenders, to the clients and prospective clients. And so you all should be commended. It's no small task to pull everybody together to get a consensus, and hopefully if you can get a vote on the floor, we'll get this passed. I've been lucky to serve as a federal defender, probably date myself for about near 30 years, maybe just shy of that, and to do so in several jurisdictions, including the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands and here in Delaware, in cases of taking me to other parts of the country. The impact is resounding in terms of these extensive mandatory sentences. And it was pleasing to hear the inspector, I apologize, talk about the commitment from law enforcement, and all the stakeholders need to be committed, and to hear or next Attorney General also state the same and bought into this as well. There's one hope that I have, and that is with respect to perhaps the second step. Some of these mandatories, particularly the drug mandatories that this bill address, we will be able to get some legislation that make them retroactive. Colleagues of mine and myself, we have clients around the country who by 21 would have committed the requisite predicates that expose them to life, and they're still doing life as a result of some of these drug convictions. I think it was Mr. Chambers that talked about we have to look beyond and start at the beginning or the front. And for me, one of those areas in involve education. I've always said,
Yes.
I've always said that reentry is a fantastic program and rehabilitation, but we have to reach out and reach down to the second, third graders or what have you, and try to bring them along. Having said that, one thing that is extremely important that we all must recognize, and I think that we all need to be exposed to this training, is implicit bias and what it plays in what we see with individuals 20, 30 years old. And it starts a lot of times with the discipline or the discipline actions that are taken in grade school and then leading to people being part of the educational program. But I want to end where I start and commend you, Senator, and everybody that contributed to the development of this legislation. Let you know that we as federal defenders support you and your efforts, and we're very grateful that we have you in the Senate and sitting on the Judiciary Committee.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Stevie, I think I just have to welcome you. I mean, you know.
It's killing me. I just want to say, no, I'm with you on everything that you're saying, and really, I know everything is a process, and it has to be step by step. But if you've lived as long as I have under this mess, that's the only way I can put it, in terms of injustices in housing and education, in crime and everything, you just get to the point that you say, okay, how long, Lord? It's done, and I ain't got that much longer, so I'm trying to get some things done before I pass
We're
out.
trying to get this done for you.
That's right, 10 years. But one thing I was gonna say to you, Senator Chris, is this. This is fantastic. Is there a way that we can do a parallel effort? I was reading, and you know how I like to do all this research. There's a place in, what is it, Spartansburg, South Carolina. They have started. They bring everybody to the table, not to talk, from anybody that has an impact on a child's life. Medicine, school, business, everybody comes. What's wrong? Why aren't they achieving? What can we do? And they get it done. I've forgotten what they call it. It's some movement, but it's an academic movement in Spartanburg. All I'm saying is that this effort in isolation is not gonna work. It's gonna be repeated over and over and over again. And Tara will tell you, coming here to Hope Commission, you know, people will say, oh, they just don't want to fill out the job application. They can't read the job application. So I'm saying there has to be this foundational change efforts. And if we can do this on a parallel, I would be thrilled. And you wouldn't hear my mouth anymore. You know better though.
I want to hear what you have to say. You know, if you think about it, we've got roughly 6,000 people in prison in the state of Delaware.
Yeah.
This is a state of 900,000 people.
Yes.
If we wrap our arms around children from the beginning,
Yes.
if they get clear discipline and stronger support, if
Yes.
they get better education and better nutrition, right? I mean, there's, many of us are parents. Some of us are grandparents. Maybe if you're a great-grandparent. You can pay me now or pay me later.
That's right.
And I recognize I'm not the person responsible for raising the taxes anymore to fund county government or state government, and those conversations are hard. But the human costs and the societal consequences, when it costs as much to send someone to college as it does to send them to prison,
Yes.
we get so much better outcomes when we invest in nutrition, and education, and healthcare, and in the community. And we do have a critical federal role to play in that, in making sure, for example, that the public health crisis of addiction doesn't lead to mass incarceration.
That's right.
And, you know, back to my time in the county, I'd have officers who were involved in our drug unit say, you know, honestly, I'm playing whack-a-mole. I'm just chasing. It'd be so much better if there were other things for these kids to do and for the users and buyers to do. And, you know, we're doing our job, we're following our mission. You ask us to do a job, we're gonna do it. But honestly, how is this making anybody's life better? To, you know, scoop up another round of kids who are just on corners and send them away for years. And that's the policymaker's job, not the law enforcement officer's job, is to make the decisions about what sorts of penalties attach to which sorts of violations. And Inspector, I think you started in the right framework, which is when the vast majority of offenders are all gonna come back out again. It's in the interest of officer safety, it's in the interest of community justice, it's in the interest of families, for us to invest right up front, and to send away those who are genuinely violent and genuinely dangerous, and to not send away those who are frankly looking for better opportunity in life, and with some redirection and support could do much better for themselves and their community. Kathleen, one of the things that impressed and surprised me was that not just the FOP, but also the ACLU said this was good enough as a first step. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how you see the federal effort and how you see the state.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for inviting me today. When I read the summary of the bill that was being presented, I thought that this is a great first step, and it reflects many changes that need to occur in Delaware as well. The ACLU is committed to education reform as well as criminal justice reform, and we do see this problem as a continuum. We're very pleased that this week the Chancellery Court denied the motion to dismiss our education lawsuit, so hopefully we will be able to address the front end of the problem. At the same time, we are joining locally and nationally with partners to have this campaign for smart justice, which goal is to reduce the prison population by 50% and challenge the racial bias in the criminal justice system. We are putting people that are directly impacted by the criminal justice system, people that have criminal records, people that have loved ones in prison, victims of crime, we're putting them at the center of that campaign because we feel that they have the most direct experience with the problem and can guide us in terms of what change needs to occur that will have the most impact directly in the community. We're partnering with the Attorney General, and we look forward to partnering with all law enforcement at all levels to create the change that we need here in Delaware. We cannot do it alone. We need to partner, and we need to work together in Dover to make the changes that we need. I'm really excited about this legislation, and I'm excited about what's happening here in Delaware as we look to the 150th General Assembly. And because ultimately, why do we want to reduce the prison population? Because to provide quality programs inside prison, we need sufficient guards. We know we have a crisis right now in the prison regarding staffing. We need funds, we need money to be able to free up inside so that we can provide high quality programming in the system so that when people come out, they are better able to succeed and not recidivate and not go back in. I mean, so it's all tied together, it's all of a piece, and we're just really excited and looking forward to the work as it unfolds over the next, 2 or 3 years.
Thank you. And to recognize a structural reality, it's taken 30 years to build up to this point. And that means at the federal and the state level, we've built infrastructure to incarcerate significant numbers of people. Over the long term, by reducing the prison population and investing more in programming and support that reduces the number of folks who go into prison, and that when people come out of prison, reduces the number that return. It will ultimately cost less money, but the transition is actually more expensive because you can't just shut down the prison. It costs the same amount to have the same building open, whether it's 100% full, 120% full, or 90% full. And I know there is some concern on the part of both federal and state appropriators, and I'm a federal appropriator, that it's going to take more money actually to deliver better drug treatment, better programs, better reentry support as we begin to implement this, if this passes this Congress. We've got about at most maybe 10 more minutes, and I just want to invite anybody who's got a perspective they want to share.
I'd like to hear from Colonel Bond.
Well, I'll be very brief in my comments, but I just want to say from my perspective, I fully support this. I found out about it yesterday and I read over the synopsis of everything, and I cannot find anything that I would disagree with. I think that this is a huge step in building relationships and trust throughout all communities, but specifically in the Black and brown communities. As has been pointed out by many people in here, many of the individuals we're talking about are Black and brown, who have been incarcerated for charges, and their incarceration time is substantially longer than others. And I think that as we fight in law enforcement to build the relationship, to build trust, this is going to help us go in that direction. Because in law enforcement, we all know, we're all lumped together. And we can go out here and we can do all the community policing we want to do. In the Newcastle County Police Department, I'm proud to say, while we may speak on crimes and we talk about crimes and our numbers are outstanding, one of the things that I like to focus on, and I want our men and women to focus on, is community policing. Going out, engaging the community, thinking of ways to solve the problem without, as Lieutenant Calhoun said, without making an arrest. We can do all that, but if on the back end, when a person is sentenced, and their sentence is extremely longer, or they feel it was unfair, it comes back on us in law enforcement. And so everything that we do is basically for nothing because we don't have that trust. I think that I hear talking about the education, and I believe wholeheartedly in that. But one of the things that I often go back to in my experience as being a police officer, one of the things I've seen in my nearly 28 years is we have continued to see an erosion of the family structure. And at the root of all of our issues and problems is the breakdown of the families. And we can put money in a lot of places, we can do a lot of things. We can buy equipment, we can do everything. But if you do not, and if we do not find a way that we can build these families and get families back together, get out of baby mama, baby daddy, let's get back to husband and wife. Let's get back to establishing your foundation before you take on the additional responsibilities. As a detective, I was always saddened by the fact that many of the individuals we brought in for serious crimes, whether it be a rape, homicide, they were young people. When you ask them, we're going to contact your parents, many of them could not tell you where their father was. Many of them had parents at that time, we're talking about the crack epidemic was in full bloom. Many of them had mothers who were dealing with substance abuse problems and issues themselves. You can't help but think that that doesn't play a role in that child being in that interview room, being interviewed by someone. I think about my own life, and I've been very fortunate. I have my parents and still alive, but I had a mother and a father in the household. And my father set limits and told me what I was going to do and what I wasn't going to do. While I didn't like him at that time, we have grown to be the best of friends. Children who don't have that opportunity are raised by somebody out there in the street who's going to give them bad advice. We need to get back, all of us, find a way, and we can talk about this, but I believe that at the core of many of our issues, we have to put an emphasis on families, giving people the resources so that they can have a productive life, a life where they can have children. When they have children, their children will be able to excel. And I believe that when you have that type of household, education is going to come because there's going to be somebody there holding you responsible. I think that there should also be a focus. Many of the people that we deal with have mental illness. And we have, in law enforcement for many years, our response to responding out to a person with mental illness was simply, if you can find a charge, lock them up. The prisons are overfilled with individuals who are suffering from mental illness. that's untreated mental illness. And so for us, again, looking outside of the box, we have our Police Connection Alliance card, where we have an officer and a mental health professional that are teamed up. They go out and they respond to those repeat calls for service for individuals who are suffering from mental illness. And I can tell you this, we have diverted several arrests as a result of that card. And so we plan to continue to do that. But I think that those issues there, along with the opioid and the addiction, which is driving many of the crimes that we see out here, the property-related crimes, doing things to address those things will ensure that we're getting people not funneled into a prison, but funneled into the appropriate resources so that they can get help to better themselves and subsequently better their families.
Right. Just going real quick, because I don't want anyone to leave here believing or thinking, and you need to suggest this, Colonel, that black men and brown men don't love their children, right? So it's a reason why black and brown men aren't engaged in their children's lives, because our research has actually bared out that black men love their children, they want to be with their children. And know that one of the basic things that we learn in statistics is this: when you see 95% of something happen, know that it's structural in nature. So every time you go out and you're talking to a kid who committed a violent crime, that his father's not there, then know that there's something structurally going on there. So I don't want anyone to leave here today believing that black and brown men don't love their children, because they really do love their children and they want to be with them. So we need to look at what is driving them not to be with their children. You know, that's one thing. That's all.
And Daryl, if I could, let me just, thank you for that point, let me just add something to it, because I mean, I've got 3 teenagers, I see the wisdom in what you're saying. My mother went through a number of years where my father was very distant. He didn't love us any less. But I was blessed to have a scoutmaster and a school teacher and a coach who knew that we were going through a hard time as a family and invested more.
Yes.
Corrected us and pushed us and saw my older brother and me doing things we shouldn't be doing, and they didn't hesitate to say, no, right, I know your dad's gone, but I need to talk to you. You come over to my house, I will sit you down. So there has for a long time been community parenting that can fill in gaps when there are parents who, for whatever reason, are either deployed or they're suffering mental health or drug addiction problems, or they're incarcerated, or they're seeking work in another state. For whatever reason, we're not always all raised by our biological mother and father, but where there's a parent who is not in the scene and not able to, we have to have other adults who step in and serve as the faith source, as the guidance source. Your core point is young people need structure, and they need mentoring, and they need guidance. And if it doesn't come in a good way, it'll come in a bad way. Gangs are really just groups of young people seeking purpose and meaning.
That's true.
And you're gonna find it whether it's in a good way on a team, playing a sport, or in a bad way in a gang, committing crimes. You're gonna find the group that reinforces you, makes you feel safe, makes you feel valued, makes you feel included. And, you know, we all know this. This is not complex. I mean, it is literally ancient wisdom. I don't for a second think that men of any background are less committed to, less affectionate towards their children. Our challenge is to reduce or combat structures that prevent parents, whether economically, socially, or because of incarceration, from being able to be engaged. And I couldn't agree more. Some of our biggest problems are public health problems, addiction and mental health. I can't tell you how many teachers say, look, I'm just trying to teach. And I gotta deal with clothing and nutrition and health and family. Kids come in, bringing all sorts of stuff into this classroom, and they go home, and I only have them so many hours a day. I've heard the same thing from law enforcement officers as long as I've been in public service. We don't like to arrest people. We'd rather have the resources to solve problems. But if the policymakers aren't providing the resources for dealing with addiction and dealing with mental health, in the end, it ends up in our police cars, and we're putting people in lockup who shouldn't be there, who ought to be in a public health facility. And one of the things we need to do is invest more.
And I think
in
also,
making that work.
Senator, along the lines of, you know, what many of our children are exposed to when they're seeing this ongoing violence. I was looking at the news last night, and I saw where they had the quadruple homicide up in Philadelphia, and they were talking to some of their family. They were talking to a young man who was probably about 15 or 16 years old. And he was talking about how he felt his heart was just ripped out. And you could see the pain in him. You have to wonder what effect that's going to have on him down the road. You know, and we can't get that treatment, you get him in, you see someone, talk to someone, is it gonna manifest itself down the road? Is it gonna turn into something negative? And it's always concerning when we see that.
On address, childhood trauma is one of the biggest problems that develop and follows that child all the way into adulthood, and then reflects in the activity the child gets involved in. And we have to do something to address it. A child that witnesses a homicide or has that type of impact, and no treatment and no counseling at that time, is impacted for the rest of his or her life.
And you know what's interesting, the one thing that we can't ignore, and I think overall we need to say it, and it's hard to say, there is such a thing as legalized racism. Right now, we're doing a thing at OSHA on legalized racism, you know, a mixed group talking about, Jim Crow, black codes and that kind of thing. But I think we need to recognize that we've got more to override than that. Prisons are big business. Underground economies are all over the place. So we can sit here at this table and none of us may own that whole drug thing is coming through, or none of us may own the laundry makers at the prison, or the food people and that kind of thing, but you gotta be realistic about this stuff. What we're talking about is big business, and it's gonna take more than just sitting here hoping that we can overcome it without addressing the fact that there is implicit bias. There is legalized racism, and you're making money of it. It's been that way since Jim Crow. You freed the slaves, and then you rehired them, so to speak, without paying them to work the farms. It's still in effect, and we just don't look at it that way.
Maybe one of the things that has made criminal justice reform hard
Yeah.
in many other states
Yes.
is for-profit prisons.
Yes,
And the industries that benefit from the prison
Yes.
complex that influence state legislatures.
right.
Delaware is less bad off than many
Yes.
other states. I've been
Yes.
struck, you know, I didn't know about that as a structure in other states until I started reading about it as a
Yeah.
senator. One of the things that has made it hard to get reform done
That's right.
is ways in which the current system has interest. And it takes effort to sort
Yes.
of pick your eyes up and look past the current system and what's currently happening and say, you know what, we'd rather arrest fewer people, we'd rather incarcerate fewer people, we'd rather treat more people, we'd rather, right? That takes effort and that takes some hope.
Yes.
I understand Colby would like to give us some insight.
Yes. I have a question concerning substance use disorder driven crime. So we focus a lot on heroin, but prior to heroin, you know, crack cocaine and cocaine played a big part in destabilizing and hurting, particularly the black and brown community. I'm wondering, is there even any conversation about looking back retroactively at substance use disorder driven crime, and also expanding it beyond just heroin, and also looking at younger people, the teenagers, particularly with the pills, benzodiazepines and substances such as that?
This doesn't answer the whole question. But to the extent, this is on the backside about where it says retroactive application of the Fair Sentencing Act. This was one of the things we fought hardest over. The bill that came over from the House did not have any of these four provisions on federal criminal sentencing. The retroactive application of the Fair Sentencing Act doesn't just say going forward will reduce the huge disparity between crack and powder cocaine. It allows a judge to look backwards and say, if you were sentenced during the period in time where there was this huge disparity, we can re-examine it and say, there was a structural unfairness in how you were sentenced, and we're gonna reopen that case, look at your conduct, look at your risk to the community, and offer opportunities for early release as a result. One of the things that happened, there was the bill that came over from the House did a lot of criminal justice reform, but did not do any sentencing reform. And we've had 6 months of fighting, quiet, below the ground, back and forth to say, nope, we need to do more, nope, we need to do more, nope, we need to do more. And it was just in the last 3 weeks that we finally got an agreement to modify that bill and to add some of these things that allow some reduction. It doesn't speak to your broader point, which is that we've got now a generation or more of folks who committed crimes really because they were caught up in the drug trade or they were themselves drug addicted at the time. We need to reorient our thinking around the public health crisis of addiction. And the reality is One of the things that I found most frustrating as a county executive was to see certain communities involved in drug abuse and drug buying able to get themselves good lawyers and figure it out and not go to jail for a long period of time, and other communities that were equally intimately involved in it going away for long periods. And that's the root of some of the dramatic inequality, both in the sentences that were handed down and in the consequences for families and for communities that have really borne the brunt of the incarceration. So, if you will forgive me, I think we've got maybe 5 more minutes, and I'd love to have a few more folks contribute, please.
Senator, one thing is just, oh, I'm sorry.
Mine will be quick.
Go ahead.
The preparation for inmates when they're successful return home. So there's a thing called collateral consequences for sentencing. So re-entry starts at your sentencing. So the collateral consequences of your offense is a lifelong sentence because of the policies that start at the judiciary all the way up to some of the agencies sitting in this room that can't employ ex-offenders because of policy. But sometimes it's ex-offenders who can do the most work with the next generation of maybe ex-offenders. Is there any more teeth, or is it in the next step to start addressing that life sentence of collateral consequences?
There are, Senator Booker tried very hard to add some of the, for lack of a better word, ban-the-box provisions about barriers to employment to this bill. That ultimately was not something we got into this bill. There's a whole series of things around barriers to employment or reemployment going forward that I think we should have taken up, that we will likely take up if this doesn't get done in this Congress. I recognize that challenge. In Delaware, because we have so many financial services institutions, it has particularly broad consequences, because getting hired, when there's banks and banks and banks and banks, then people who are going to work landscaping or work culinary or work maintenance have to meet a higher standard of not having a criminal history than would be the case in a lot of other communities. I think it has particularly significant consequences here. Even when we've got full employment, I know a number of young men who just can't get a job here because of their criminal history. So, please.
I just want to offer 2 things. One, just the word implicit, the term implicit bias that's being used throughout the morning. The Webster's definition of the word implicit means implied, though not plainly expressed. May I offer that we bring our truth to light in a truthful way by using the word explicit, which is the definitive opposite of the word implicit. Because what we're seeing is data-driven. There's nothing implied but not plainly expressed about what we're talking about. What we're seeing is the explicit, data-supported, research-centered bias that has been intergenerational, and I love you, Corporal Bonds, for all the work that you've done throughout the community, but for your articulate way that you've expressed what has deliberately been happening in Black and brown families that is explicit. When we started One Village Alliance in 2009, the data that came out of University of Delaware was that 87% of the homes in the Eastside community were void of an adult male. That exact same year, a research study out of the exact same institution said that 87% of nonviolent offenders who are incarcerated in the state of Delaware are Black men. Let's stop asking where fathers are and suggesting that they don't care. They're incarcerated. The most successful fatherhood program, the Achievement Center, extraordinary. All of our organizations, wonderful. The most successful program in the world universe for fathers is incarceration in the state of Delaware. We're doing it at a higher rate than anywhere in the world. We gotta start talking about it in a truthful way, and we could talk about early reading and early education. Parents are the primary educators of their children. Parents are the primary nutritionalists, the healthcare workers, the doctors. What we're seeing is explicit, intentional bias. Let's talk about it for what it is. Colonel Bonds, I thank you so much. And that is coming from a law enforcement officer families is the only way, and deliberately, as intentionally as we tore families apart, intentionally, we need to intentionally, explicitly put them back together. There's nothing implicit about this.
If you haven't read the new Jim Crow, I think you just delivered the summary of it. And the tragedy of multi-generational structural racism and its impact through the criminal justice system is something that is right in front of us.
Well
And so
documented.
we have an opportunity to address it. And if people of goodwill are willing to come together and make compromises, we can make a big difference that puts fathers back in communities and back in families.
Thank you for your continued work, Senator Coons, and your support on that.
Senator, we are gonna have to wrap up. We are at time. You wanna give me one sentence?
One sentence. Thank you very much for the support you've given to the programs in the prison where I teach. And thank you for those individuals who are leaders in the community who will be willing to come in and speak to the men, because when we have guest speakers coming in from the community to encourage these men to pursue the programs that we're teaching them in the prison system, they do markedly better, and most of them have been able to get jobs coming out of prison. Thank you again, Senator.
Thank you. Folks,
Just one quote.
like one quote, thank you, and then we're gonna wrap.
I'm going to read this, and I'm just touching on one thing. The degree of civilization in society can be judged by entry into prisons. I'm incredibly encouraged. I'm a felon by the leaders of the state of Delaware here today, talking in the right direction about prison reform. And at the root of everything, the accomplishments you've been able to achieve in Wilmington, it's compassion. It's recidivism rates, it's statistics, it's numbers, but it's really an issue of humanity. Are we going to have compassion for our neighbors? Are we going to have compassion for our communities? And we can sit back and judge an individual who committed a crime, and we're not having compassion for them, and we're doing exactly what we're upset with them about. Because when you commit a crime, you lack compassion. So we have to take ownership of ourselves, have compassion for everyone else, and that'll lead us in the right direction. And I just really want to say thank you. I am an ex-felon. I appreciate the leaders of our state coming together, and I'm so encouraged by the dialogue that was here today, and I know we're going to go in the right direction. So thank you.
I think now you can guess why I prefer any day in Delaware to any day in Delaware. Thank you all. Thank you for the investment of time and heart and energy, and I'm so grateful for what you're bringing to the table.
And thank you.